I'm going to read once again from my Mind and Evolution as assessed through reviews of major texts. Evolution of Beauty by Richard O. Prum, 2017. I'm always hoping I'll come across stories that enhance my appreciation of living creatures. I started Prum's book hoping to find there such a story. What I found was more complicated. I don't care whether a story is true. I anyway wouldn't know how to tell. I'm satisfied if it leaves me feeling that I understand nature better. I can usually tell that in advance from what kind of a story it is. It is just so or as if. Just so stories don't help you appreciate anything. They tell you it's just so. An example of that is the modern synthesis of genetic mutation and natural selection, of anything in nature of which I want to know why or how. It simply says, it's just so. That may be true, but it doesn't add anything to my understanding. I began reading Prum's book on the lookout for what kind of a story he'd be telling. If it was a just so story, I'd read no further. What I hoped to find instead was an as if story. That's a story that adds meaning to some aspect of nature, ideally to nature in general. Richard Dawkins provided us with a story like that in his book The Selfish Gene. He didn't mean genes really are selfish. He meant that from what he knew about evolution, it was as if genes are selfish. Take that story to heart, he assured us, and you'll feel you understand nature better too. Prum's introduction charmed me. His writing was direct, personal, full of incident, full of feeling, and he did indeed promise me a new story. Quote, I have always been more fascinated by those aspects of evolutionary process that defy simplistic, adaptive explanations. Aesthetic evolution has great explanatory power and rescues us from the tedious and limiting adaptionist insistence on the ubiquitous power of natural selection. Finally, the evolutionary dynamics of mate choice are essential to understanding ourselves. Terrific! I was going to encounter some other story than the just so of the modern synthesis, a story we could apply to more fully understand ourselves. However, Prum's field of sexual selection offers us slim pickings of as-if stories able to contribute to our understanding. Most evolutionists insist on giving animal choice no place at all in evolution, he reports. He mimics them. Quote, what can we possibly know about the subjective experiences of desire in animals? Subjective experience is, almost by definition, unmeasurable and unquantifiable. He goes on, most scientists have therefore been allergic to the idea of making a scientific study of subjective experiences, or even to admitting that they exist. They regard sexual displays and preferences merely as parts of the environment a creature must become adapted to. For them, Prum mourns, beauty is merely the handmaiden of natural selection. That's not so for him. Quote, although I am rather hesitant to admit it, I think that the process of adaptation by natural selection is sort of boring. Of course, as an evolutionary biologist, I am well aware that it is a fundamental and ubiquitous force in nature. I don't deny its immense importance. But the process of adaptation by natural selection is not synonymous with evolution itself. A lot of evolutionary process and evolutionary history cannot be explained by natural selection alone. His own fieldwork tells against it. Of bowerbirds, he says, "But how do we know that bower design and ornamentation perform an exclusively aesthetic function? Well, we know that the bower serves no physical purpose other than as a location where courtship takes place." Not only that, quote, "Evolution can even be decadent in the sense of its resulting in sexual ornaments that not only fail to signal anything about objective mate quality, but actually lower the survival and fecundity of the signaler and the chooser. In short, in pursuit of their subjective preferences, individuals can make mating choices that are maladaptive, resulting in a worse fit between the organism and its environment. Natural selection is not the only source of design in nature. The responsible agent in the story Prum wants to tell will involve factors, appreciation of the beautiful and freedom of choice within the subjective experience of individual creatures. Quote, "For me, however, the concept of subjective experience is absolutely critical to understanding evolution. I will argue that we need an evolutionary theory that encompasses the subjective experiences of animals in order to develop an accurate scientific account of the natural world. We ignore them, subjective experience in animals, we ignore them at our intellectual peril because the subjective experiences of animals have critical and decisive consequences for their evolution." End of quote. So Prum is intent on establishing a beachhead behind which to gather support for an evolutionary theory that encompasses the subjective experiences of animals. Talk about fools rushing in. While lauding Darwin in extravagant terms for his boldness in making individual female choice one of the drivers of evolution, sexual selection, Prum appears intent on focusing the world's attention onto what I see as a glaring contradiction in Darwin's work. Here's how I put it. According to Darwin, peacocks grew enormous tails because peahens like them that way. If merely liking something could make a creature evolve it, then all of evolution could be driven by creatures liking things. Then who needs natural selection? This idea that creatures can evolve whatever they want merely by wanting it makes of evolution nothing more than a giant law of attraction. Creatures will get whatever they wish for hard enough. Yet that does seem to me the principle behind Darwin's mechanism of sexual selection. By wanting it, peahens can get peacocks to evolve just the kind of tails they'd like. Why didn't Darwin go on from there to assume that all of evolution could be driven like that, by living creatures experiencing wants in the course of their interactions with the environment? Instead, he retreated timidly back to account for all of evolution through a strict reductionist, adaptionist mechanism, accepting only the one instance he couldn't make that mechanism account for: sexually induced ornaments in birds. But by doing so, he left the door open for others to say, If creatures wanting some evolutionary change could make it happen in one instance, why not in all? That's exactly the door that other evolutionists want to keep firmly closed. That's exactly the door that Prum seems intent on flinging wide open. In the following paragraph, he implies that ornaments and sexual preferences for these ornaments differ from all other subjective experiences only because, in their case, how subjective experiences trigger physical evolution is particularly easy to trace. Quote, "We cannot measure or know what these subjective experiences are like in any detail, but we can sneak up on them, and, as with the electron, we can learn fundamental things about them indirectly. For example, as we will see, we can investigate how subjective experiences evolve by tracing the evolution of ornaments and the sexual preferences for them among closely related organisms." End of quote. To summarize my very long introduction, Prum intends, through his study of sexual selection in birds, to come up with a story about how they evolved that will help us understand how evolution works in nature in general, and ultimately how it works in us. What I looked forward to finding out from the rest of his book was how much of evolution he was prepared to convert over from the adaptionist just-so story to a subjective experiences story. And just who did he think was having these subjective experiences? Perhaps because it's so common amongst us, it's easy to imagine males giving in to nagging from their mates about looking good and dressing more colorfully. In ducks, for example, females can see how males look and keep after them until they've shaped up. Vision provides a ready feedback loop within the individual duck by which she can detect discrepancies between what she would like to see and what she actually sees. And that goes for all of the senses. That presumably is what led Darwin to set this kind of evolutionary change apart from evolution by natural selection and call it sexual selection, and for Prum to prefer the more specific term, aesthetic selection. That is, selection can be driven by an aesthetic sense within subjective experiences in individual living creatures, as we humans detect having an aesthetic sense operating within our subjective experience. Prum then goes on to describe the seasonal eruption of violence as drakes coerce females into having sex. In association with this contest between male coercion and female choice, strange things happen. Drakes' penises grow to an absurd length and extend themselves within the female's vaginas through a clockwise twisting movement, like an elaborate lockpicker's tool. The females, in defense of choice, develop a similarly convoluted vagina with blind endings and a characteristic counterclockwise twist to stall the male. But is the story of aesthetic selection plausible when applied to a case like this? While it's easy to see how these strategies fulfill the wants of both sexes, where is the central feedback by which they could be monitored by the individuals? Even if the female could imagine turning her vagina into an obstacle course for the male's penis, how could she be directing a process she can't manage in the same way she could visually manage how well her drakes are conforming to her vision of how they should look? But even a story involving the volition of individual creatures can be stretched only so far. Prum goes on to give another example, the club-winged mannequin, unique for the male having altogether reconfigured ulnas, 4 times wider and 3 times larger in volume than those of related species. Quote, in fact, there is nothing else like it in any other bird in the world. End of quote. Birds' ulnas have been honed to an invariable, sleek, mechanical perfection over 135 million years of adaptation to the demands of flight. Yet uniquely in the males of this species, it has become reshaped in an extraordinarily complicated manner to generate sounds as part of the male's courtship dance. Quote, it is the acoustic collaboration among the multiple feathers attached to the male's ulnas that gives the sound its distinctive harmonic structure and decidedly musical, ringing, violin-like quality. Surely the idea of reshaping a part of your body vital to flight so extravagantly, merely to serve sexual display, could not have arisen in the subjective experience of any one animal. In my judgment, any story accounting for such evolutionary changes through subjective experience has to locate whatever mind is making these imaginative leaps elsewhere than in individual living creatures. Have I lost you? Let's recap. Whose subjective experience is involved in sexual selection? In the case of the duck directing how her drakes dress, we can imagine it being her. We can imagine it taking place in her mind, since she can monitor the process visually as it's going on. That's an aesthetic selection story. But in the case of the reconstruction of her vagina during mating season, it's hard to imagine such a thought entering her mind, and even if it did, it's hard to see how it could take place without her being equipped with senses through which she could monitor the process. So who is exerting choice on her behalf? Perhaps it is a representative of the female of her species, about which we might create a story involving some ancient female goddess. But even this won't suffice in the case of the bird with the singing ulnas. The process of shaping his ulna occurs so early in development that it affects the female also, who therefore are burdened with the same impediments as the male, but without any corresponding benefit. It seems unlikely that even a female representative of the female of her species would inflict such a pointless burden on her, would so punish her for her lustful delight in her mate's performance. So in this case, is the subjective experience occurring in the mind of the species as a whole, in expression of its desire to contribute this enhanced performance to the wonders of nature, even at the cost of lessened fitness in both of the species' sexes? For me, Prum's researches on birds have opened up a huge can of worms. He has analyzed the courtship dances of tropical birds into their component parts and has been able to trace the origins of individual components back to ancestor species still living 1,000 miles away. Some appear entirely original and the product of creative subjectivity. Yet it seems impossible to locate the subjective experiences through which he expects to account for the evolution of such items in the minds of individual living creatures. So must we default back to the prevailing just so story, the modern synthesis? No. Prum's fieldwork makes that highly implausible too. Anyway, I'm sure Prum wouldn't want to see us forced back to that resort. Through his rashness, Prum seems to me to have indeed reduced to a pile of tiny chips all the principles we have available to account for the remarkable creatures he studies. Instead, his fieldwork hints at shadowy intelligences lurking in the undergrowth or the canopy, directing the evolution of some of the most remarkable tools and ornaments with which living creatures come equipped. Okay, that's the inference, but where's the story? Prum admits he doesn't have one. Perhaps to the story of sexual selection he found in Darwin, he should have added that identified by Siddhartha Mukherjee in his The Gene, quote, "The crucial driver in evolution, Darwin understood, was not nature's sense of purpose, but her sense of humor," end of quote. Lacking such a story, Prum ends his book with no more revelations about how we evolved than some details of our genitalia.